I really want to make work about this. And I really want to make work about how it is difficult to traverse this journey of living in a colony, but ultimately there are these like glimpses of joy within that practice that one can use to like reshape, to deface, to blur, to like form into something new.
Hello, print friends, and welcome back from this unexpected hiatus. My laptop gave up the ghost a couple of weeks ago, and I've been trying to fix it, but I finally just had to get a new one. In fact, you probably can tell I haven't even got my mic configured yet. But the good news is we are back, and so without further ado, this is a bilingual podcast. So if you subscribe to us, you'll be getting episodes in English with me, as well as in Spanish with Reynaldo Gil Zambrano. Together we speak to people around the globe about their practice and passions in the field of print media and multiples. This episode is brought to you by Legion Paper. Legion Paper is a fine art paper company that represents the best papers in the world. They either stock it, source it, or make it, with brands like Stonehenge, Somerset, Coventry, Reeves, Arches, and more. Legion is the best paper resource for every artist and printmaker's needs. Learn more about the variety of papers Legion stocks at www.legionpaper.com. My guest this week is Mariana Ramos Ortiz, an artist whose work explores the structural and temporal qualities of sand in relation to themes of occupation, self-determination, permanence, and protection within the context of Puerto Rico's ongoing colonial realities. In our conversation, we discuss how they use play and communication as tactics of protest and healing, the role of ephemerality in material experimentation and printmaking, and how their practice engages with landscape, memory, and resistance as acts of reflection and reclamation. Hi, Mariana. How's it going?
Hi, all good here. How are you?
I'm really good. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I actually got introduced through your work at a conference. Someone was talking about your amazing practice in their presentation, and I just was furiously taking notes because I was instantly intrigued by it. And so when I reached out and you were keen to chat, I was really thrilled. So I'm really looking forward to learning more.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I don't know, it's such a delight to be I didn't even know a printmakers podcast existed. So like it's really exciting to be in conversation with like other printmakers and yeah, no, this is really fun for me.
So, before we jump into things, I always ask my guests to introduce themselves and I invite them to answer the questions who you are, where you are, what you do.
Okay. So I'm Mariana Ramos Ortiz. I am an artist, printmaker, sculptor, all sorts of things. And I was born in Puerto Rico, in Cabo Rojo, Puerto Rico. And I currently live in New York. I just moved here to begin a 1 year residency. So pretty fresh here in the city. And I'd say if I were to say what I do, I make prints, I make sculptures, I make ephemeral installations that all aim to consider ideas of landscape, memory, resistance, protection in the context of Puerto Rico's ongoing colonial realities. And I consistently gravitate to sand as an archival material, as a sort of repository of our collective memory. And I'm fascinated by its ability to be able to witness like our past or tap into our past, to be able to record the present of certain spaces and situations, and then also its magicalness and fleetingness and all these other qualities that it has that I think allow me to think about the future and to be a participant in building that future.
Beautiful. I definitely have a lot of sand questions for you in my notes here. So I'm really looking forward to talking more about that. But a little bit more on background. You said that you grew up in Puerto Rico. What role did art play in that part of your life?
Yeah. So I say I grew up in Cabo Rojo, which is a small town on the, it's a big municipality, but of course it's very much a town on the southwest island and the southwest west of the island. And I was always I'm painting, I'm drawing. I think my parents were very active in providing me like these creative outlets and like always being able to and to use all sorts of to play instruments. I like grew up also playing instruments and things like that. And so I think I was always very much gravitating towards having some creative like output. I went to a small high school that had a program to allow students to at some point begin to take courses at a university level. And so I'd say it was more catered towards students that were interested in doing med school at some point and knew that
Mm,
they would be in school for a lot of years. So it was a great way to start to get ahead and things like that. And but I was really clear on not wanting to necessarily do any of the sciences. I was able to have the school support me in taking art classes. I think before
mm,
that, I hadn't really ever taken art classes. I think many people might relate to this feeling of just like being like, I don't know, it's just something that you love so much and like feeling a little terrified that someone would deem that you maybe weren't good at it, or maybe you, I don't know, it just gets tarnished or something, or there is that possibility. But if you just keep it as a hobby for yourself, then it just has this really nice, just you keep it fresh, right? And I wasn't able to take, I just didn't take any art classes until like I was finishing high school. And luckily, one of the first classes I ever took, and it was just by pure accident, which I think is a way that a lot of people stumble into printmaking. They're like, oh, it's the only course that's empty, or there's some spots here. And so that's exactly what happened. And I just took an intaglio course for the first time. And I knew of printmaking a little bit. I didn't know much about it, but so much of Puerto Rico's history, I feel like, is so intertwined with this practice. Whether you
mm,
understand the technique or process, like you've definitely seen a screen print of some like political importance in a history book or something like that. And so I
mm,
think that this medium always had this sort of importance. And now I think of it maybe more in just there is this importance of being able to talk to like people in the past who were like using this medium to resist the same topics or
mm,
the same context that I'm also trying to like tackle. But anyways, just to say that I was able to take that course and I completely fell in love with the process, with the idea of being able to be in community with others and to create work, how open and how also no one really knew how the process works. So like we're all pretty everyone feels like they're in the same sort of like playing field. And so that was really appealing to me, and the sense of community that a print shop holds, and amazing professors also that I had that are, you know, incredible educators and like key artists of printmaking in Puerto Rico. And so I was really lucky to be able to engage with people like that in the first beginning stages of making prints, and then also just like even thinking of myself as an artist. So that was really empowering. And quickly after, I was just like, I want to do printmaking. I think this is really exciting. I began to learn more about the history of it in Puerto Rico and just its importance, and really feel again this sense of like empowerment through this practice. And I went to college, to the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras, and started to like, I guess, dive more into this world of printmaking and take all sorts of classes like screen printing, lithography, relief, like all sorts of things. And I really loved that there, I think from the start of my, I guess, my engagement with printmaking, I was always very experimental, and I think that that was always
mm,
very much like pushed in this medium, just because I think that there is a difference in terms of like access to certain materials. And I'm also at this like public university that is trying to create a print shop for all, truly, and for any person to come in. So I think that there is a different culture that comes through and that gets developed, where so much of the inks that we're using are potentially not the inks that like you would automatically use in a really nice pristine like print shop, or like the
Mm.
process that we're using, or like the amount of blankets that we're using to print. And so there's all these things that we're not even trying to cut corners, but I think like it becomes this process where you begin to experiment and decide what things are necessary and what things are not necessary. And so it's almost this like guerrilla style like printing that I began to learn about, and I just loved it so much. And so much of it was rooted in not necessarily having these very fixed rules on how you like come into a process itself, or how you make a one thing, or what even you call this thing. And that was really essential. And then eventually I ended up going to, after 2017, after like the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, I was able to go to Brown University for a year to continue my studies, since the University of Puerto Rico was paused at the time. And so through a program they had, I was able to secure a scholarship and just spend a full year of taking other print courses, book arts, and just like being in conversation with other artists in Providence, which to me, that was like a key moment in my upbringing as an artist, where
Mm.
just being in Providence is such an artist heavy town, such a printmaker's town too. I just really like was able to see myself as an artist, I think, there, and to meet others who were printing and creating all sorts of different works that were not just on paper, that were not just editions. There was this new world that was like absolutely opened for me while being there. And so quickly I just decided I want to finish my last year at the University of Puerto Rico. So I went back, finished, and then I went straight to the Rhode Island School of Design to do an MFA in printmaking. And yeah, I think that is my relationship to like how I began to engage with like arts and like printmaking as a whole.
So, what was that transition like for you to go from a practice that sounds like was very rooted in place, was rooted in where you grew up, and then go to a place that is very different in terms of climate, in terms of your surroundings, but then continue to explore from a distance this
Mhm.
practice?
Yeah, that I think that is like truly to be in Providence and to have had that time and that distance was a key factor in the work that I'm like in developing the work that I make today, for sure. I think that, as you said, like that distance was so important. And it's something that I think like I think about today every day, because like I've had moments of being back in Puerto Rico and like creating work and being there for a full year teaching and trying to maintain a studio practice, and then doing that here in the US in different places, whether it is through residencies or other like job opportunities. And it's so different, and not just because of that distance. I think the distance is like when you're in Puerto Rico, you are living and consistently having to grapple and like these topics that you sometimes remove and put into your studio and think about are your life and are so present in like just the day to day of where how you like I don't know go to work and come back, or what happens on that weekend. Like I think that there is so much of that not feeling, but just like proximity that like that kind of gets removed, and to have that distance can be very beautiful in the sense that you can like breathe and you can see things from a different perspective and have a certain pause in the hecticness of what a lot of these like issues feel like firsthand or immediately. And
Mm.
so definitely having that distance was incredible. And then I think also being in a place like Providence during that time, I didn't go to Providence by myself. There were around like 30 students that were also dealing with the same things, leaving family, their families potentially not having power after the hurricane.
Mm.
So many things that we had a life and picked up and suddenly appeared in this like the sense of community that I think is also formed in that context is was so special to looking at my work and looking at the things that were important to me from a completely different perspective. And I think also the support from professors. At the time I took a book arts course with an incredible professor, Erica Mena, and they were a poet and then also like a book artist, and their relationship to this new medium that I had never really even like tackled was so formative in the way that I like could relate to a lot of topics back home. We worked on this artist book by Raquel Salas Rivera's book While They Sleep, Under the Bed is Another Country. And we, before that book was published, which it just became a really beautiful book that dealt with a lot of the aftermath of the hurricane. Just like being able to work on an artist book based on these thoughts by a poet that also related to me, and to have that space, and that space also be like forged by like people who were also like interested in these topics and were also grappling in their own way with a lot of these topics, was just essential. And so yeah, to have that distance but then to also find closeness within that
Mm,
distance with like other folks who are away from home but are also just trying to continue to maintain that like that link to home, and continuing to just develop and even heal a lot of the things that
mhm.
like we went through being back home.
Yeah. What a unique set of circumstances to have all of those things line up to come together. So it's like you're, as you say, you're away from home, but you have brought a bit of your community with you who do understand where you are. And then you get to continue to explore that. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I could see how it would be very formative in your practice and your ideas around what you do. Yeah. I would love to talk about sand now.
Yeah.
And at what point did you start working with it? How did that start? What was the initial inspiration to engage with this medium in an artistic lens?
Yeah, at the time, so when I started to work with sand, I was beginning grad school at RISD, and I had friends, funny enough, I had friends that were sending me materials. Like I would ask them to send me leaves and to, I don't know,
Mhm.
maybe a bag of sand. And so I had all sorts of materials that I think, again, talking about this distance, like having this distance and then trying to find newer ways to create closeness while away made me really think about materials and just these objects. And so I had friends just send me a bag of sand and, as I said, like these leaves and objects and letters and all these sort of things. And so I had them around in my studio. And so in the process of just like experimenting and also researching, looking how these materials had been used in the past, looking how other artists were relating to them, I always like to highlight there's this piece by Alora and Calzadilla that like they create during the protests that were happening in Vieques, one of the islands close that are a part of Puerto Rico, one of the islands closest to it. Um, there was this sort of political protest happening to try to get the Marina de Vieques, or like the US Navy that was using the island as a practice bombing range, to sort of exit the island because of like the ecological devastation, because of what it even represents to bomb in this colony of yours, all these sorts of things. And they had a beautiful piece where they had made the like engraved into the soul of the shoes of certain protesters and then had them walk around the shore creating these prints on sand. And so that was such a beautiful piece that I found really early on, and it made me think all sorts of things that I've talked about like sand being able to record and document, about this like archival quality, to even think I'm also, as like we begin to also understand climate change more and it becomes more present in our lives. And I am a generation that I
Mm.
think has had to definitely deal with a lot of it in Puerto Rico. I'm part of our generation. And I think that the shore and the materials and objects on the shore become so prevalent and important in informing us of like change of these spaces and these boundaries. And yeah, I truly, I think I began to develop like a language for sand and an importance. And so then I was like, how can I like incorporate it into my work? And a
Mm.
lot of it just began, I just began like screen printing and flocking certain prints with sand, and just having these like prints that were ephemeral that you could touch and deface. And so there would be these underlying prints under them. And so a lot of that exploration happened in that way. I always also say that like when I was younger, we used to, when we would go to the beach, we used to build couches made of sand and leave them there on the beach.
Hmm.
So like you would just create this like sculptural couch and then leave it on the beach for others to use. And so I think I've always been very connected to that material, and it was just a matter of kind of like, what does it mean to me in this present context, in this distance, in this proximity? And so, how can I begin to incorporate it into the work? And a lot of screen printing was those beginning stages. And then eventually it turned into more of a sculptural practice, a practice of even literally screen printing on loose sand itself, and all sorts of things.
I did as much of a deep dive as I could on your work from what you can find online and finding other things. And it looked like, and let me know if I'm wrong, but just from what I could see, that there's some pieces that are printed on sand that look like they may have been preserved in some way. They look like they were actually leaning up against a wall, like they held form and held structure in a way. And then there were others that you could see were, as you say, degrading over time. You mentioned actual people interacting with them. And so I was curious about the different properties of sand and its ability to, of course, create something fairly permanent. It can make bricks, it can be really stable, but also pliable. And so for you, as you interact with it, what pieces be in the ephemera and what pieces do you lean towards having the permanence, and just why? Because it is such a versatile medium on which to print.
Yeah, when I first started to print, I started to just print on loose sand. I had no idea how these images would be preserved, and it just wasn't even like a concern for me. I was like, I'm just going to print on loose stuff. That's it. That's what I'm doing. And so a lot of those are just sort of these charcoal prints on wet sand without like just water and sand. And then they dry, and that's how you sort of get the loose sand print. But then later on, and it was actually because I wanted to make more sculptures, also have this like sculptural practice that for me it's very much rooted in a lot of printmaking and like the matrix and like repetition and creating almost these editions of sculptures like gathered together. And so while I was researching how I would be able to have sand be contained, and I looked at a lot of different materials, and I think for me it was important that even the pieces of sand that I wanted to like structurally preserved, like I still wanted them to be ephemeral in the sense that if you like drop them or if you like
Mm.
handle them too hard, they still can break and they still can go back into its like complete loose form. And so that really discarded a lot of using epoxy and like all these sort of curable materials, right? And just doing through just researching and like looking at how other people use these materials. And a lot of it was looking at like metal casting and things like that. They have this material called green sand, which is a mixture of powdered clay with sand itself. And so I began to dive into that and look at all sorts of different clays and how they would alter the sand itself, and eventually landed at a type of clay that really mixes well with the sand and kind of maintains its like already natural components, and that feels, it doesn't feel like it is clay in the sand itself. And so that's how I ended up creating the other pieces that are more preserved. So in a sense, like they feel more
Mm.
preserved, they are a little bit more structural, but they can be quite fragile too, depending on how you handle them. And having those two options was really incredible because, as you said, like I could begin to think about what pieces could completely destroy themselves and then what pieces or feel more fragile, which I think is an important part of my work, to create these like glimpses of a landscape and then to play around with both creating a sense of fragility and precarity, but then also having other pieces that completely defy like this narrative that we ascribe to sand as this like material that is very susceptible, that sort of moves around and is pushed by the
Mhm.
wind. So think of sand maybe more as a structural resistant material. And so I think for me, like it is about narrative. I think of there's this piece I have called Construyendo a base del derrumbe, which translates to building on the basis of collapse. And it's a video piece of this print on sand that slowly transforms. And so for me, it was important to have that piece be loose because I was really trying to think about the capacity for the landscape to transform itself and create new
Mm.
versions of itself. And so to have that possibility of shifting was really essential in kind of for me to explore that idea. And yeah, I'd say like it just completely depends. And as I said, I think that there are times where my interest is in creating a piece of work that really allows us to tap into these ideas of like fragility of space or fleetingness of space, and to think about why of that, like the why of that fleetingness. But then there, I don't think like I think that it is also really healthy to think about the strength of space and to think about the materials that already exist in that space and how they allow for resistance and for protection. And so I work with so many elements that are like present on like the geographies of the shore, to think of like sand, to think of these boundaries, to think of palm trees and mangroves as these sort of like barriers that are, you know, sort of like buffering wind, buffering storms, buffering
Hmm.
like tide and all these certain things. And so I think that the decision to think of these loose, more easily susceptible ephemeral objects is more about whether I want to tap into these ideas of this space being like on the verge of collapse or being fragile, or do I want to have a conversation about how like incredible it is that it's able to like withstand and resist, and through that like resistance reimagine space in the future.
This is a good place to bring in something that you talked about earlier, which is that sort of all of this in the context of Puerto Rico's ongoing colonial realities as well. And the words that you're saying about protection, about boundaries, about borders, I feel like that is all in there. But is there something you want to talk to specifically under that umbrella of that side of your practice too, as it relates to these pieces?
Yeah, absolutely. I like to think about, there is a piece I have that is called breeze blocks, and there's like different iterations of that work itself. And that piece itself, I think for me, I was like looking into a lot of the process of like modernity in the island, and to think about these like key moments. And of course one of them that like jumps out is the construction of levitt towns on the island. And
Mm.
a lot of that was like happening during the 60s. It was this sort of like process and desire for a lot of like settlers and Americans to think of this island as this industrialized space, as this space that where we are going from the sort of like the campos and the sort of the fields and like working agriculture, to think about these cities and these factories and this new economy that we wanted to build. And so the Levittown kind of becomes this project or urbanist project of like creating these like almost gated communities and structures, and to have people live together in community closest or adjacent to cities. And so a key element of that process was the design that was used for a lot of these homes. And so one of these like very prevalent designs is the breeze block itself, which is one that I go into in a lot of my sculptures. And so I thought it was such an interesting design just by itself. It's a design that's used to like filter harsh sunlight and to filter like the wind and to create these ideas of privacy and visibility. And to me, it felt very much tactical. And I think after 2017 and the hurricane, just seeing how a lot of these different structures and the home in itself becomes this space of protection against both like the hurricane itself, but then also I think the aftermath that is very much exacerbated by our political relationship to the US. And so these homes and this like design of the breeze block that is used to like create walls and accents and small fences around homes, seeing a lot of these elements have paint chipped off, and like it felt like they had withstood something, created a different way of looking at them for me. And I began to bring them into my practice and to create these fences. And to I'm already thinking of the shore and the coast as a space that like that has this like key purpose of protecting inland, right? And so I began to think about these sort of like breeze blocks and these accents as these like barricades or these other forms of interpretations of the shore in these more urban spaces, and to use the sand as again this like material that can position these structures and places and landscapes in this kind of like fragile but yet like sturdy, sort of difficult space. And so I don't know,
Mm.
I think that for me a lot of this work has been about not only sharing my thoughts and the history of a lot of these components that at times feel very harmless, like they are just design
Mm.
components or whatever it is, but they are participants in a broader historical process. And I think that for me, creating this work and to be able to think about these objects, how they relate to each other, materials, becomes a way for myself to also, I guess, create a new interpretation of history for myself. I think that in many people that maybe have grown up in Puerto Rico can relate that a lot of the history that we get taught in school is has so many blank spaces, has so many
Mm-hmm.
strange interpretations. And so I think that a lot of our work once we're out of those spaces is to kind of decode and to like find meaning for ourselves of a lot of the things that have happened. And so I think that my work often becomes that. It becomes a space to kind of not just to like share and say, hey, this is what happened in 1960, but I think it's a personal process of like reflection and learning about certain gaps that or certain things that I just absolutely did not know about that happened.
Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of people are taking it in of themselves to fill in those gaps and
Yeah.
discovering, what is there when we do have the opportunity to educate ourselves. And then artists such as yourself who can use that as art as a vehicle to actually express the gaps, even in this sort of nonlinear storytelling, is really powerful. I would love to hear you speak about as well this idea as play as a tactic for resistance. I know you've done works that sort of center play as well and have elements of interaction. So, in terms of creating things that are even interactive with audience and also using that as a way to communicate some of these issues. What are some examples of that in your work? And is it something that you feel like you're currently engaging with as well?
Yeah, this was one of the first works I also did with sand, which is called La Peregrina, which translates to the hopscotch. And at the time, I was like coming back to school after spending some, I don't know, the summer in Puerto Rico. And it was the summer that we had the protest to have our then governor resign from its position due to really terrible stuff he had said and a lot of sort of things that had come out as a result of his incapacity to handle the aftermath of the hurricane and make proper decisions for the country. And a lot of Puerto Ricans were out in the streets protesting for his resignation. And it was such an
Mhm.
interesting flourishing, I think, for our island because I think that there's always been a practice of protesting. I think like students tend to protest a lot, but to see an entire like country, regardless of like political parties and like all these sort of things, have this common interest of finding a lot of his actions like despicable and like uniting to like protest for his resignation was just quite incredible. And I think that it was a summer of seeing a lot of forms of protest. I think that like Puerto Ricans from the beginning of time, there are these like practices of bomba and plena, which are all these sort of musical dance like practices that have been left over by a lot of the people who were enslaved in Puerto Rico. And a lot of it goes into telling stories as a form of warning others, of having percussionist musical conversations with like dancers. And there is this like combative energy to this like musical and dance style. And I think that historically there's always been this idea of just disguising protests through these like joyful acts of music, of dance, of all sorts of things. And so I think that in 2019, where we were in these protests, a lot of that sort of again began to come through. And so there
Mm.
is a lot of chants, a lot of music, a lot of trying to get all sorts of people in all sorts of contexts to protest. And I'm thinking there were like kayak protests, there were people in horses and motorcycles gathering together, to literally masses of people like doing all sorts of like quirky activities, like going underwater in scuba wear and like holding their chants written on pieces of plastic. And I think that there are all these sort of ways of protesting that like connect to joy in Puerto Rico, that I left after that summer, and I was like, oh, I really want to make work about this. And I really want to make work about how it is difficult to traverse this journey of living in a colony, but ultimately there are these like glimpses of joy within that practice that one can use to like reshape, to deface, to blur, to like form into something new. I love the hopscotch. I think is a game that like we don't even have to think about how we play it. Like we see the structure and understand how to participate in a way, but I want to enhance these ideas of an impossible game, or a game that can like tap into ideas of like tiredness, of repetition, of circularity, and the structure of this hopscotch being circular and large and like ongoing became very
Mm.
prevalent. And so then and this was also by the time I was able to start to share this work, it was like the beginning of the pandemic, so it was really hard to have folks be able to participate in together all in one space. But during the times that I was able to do that, like I think that there was this like having, at first like I thought that like potentially having one person jump around it would like
Mm.
shape or reshape it or blur it or turn it into this like dirt path or something like that. And then I quickly realized that it really is hard to do that as a one person job. So I began to invite groups of people to play around it and jump on it like collectively, which I think was such a surprise and such a beautiful layer of meaning added to the piece, to have to collectively participate to shape it into something else or to undo it. And I think there's so many interpretations of it. And I think it's just like a piece that I was able to tap into a lot of the joy that I felt in protesting that summer,
Mm.
and a sense of collectivity that I think was very present during that time.
Where do the images that you screen print onto the sand come from? Are they things that you've created? Are they images that you select? How do they end up on your work and in your work?
First, because I was making a lot of this work while being at RISD and was far away, I would just get small times or just like short times to go back home. I was really relying on a lot of the pictures that I was like taking with my camera roll. It's funny because I think that when you live in Puerto Rico and you're not thinking that like you're ever leaving, you're just there, you're not really taking pictures, or I wasn't taking
Right,
pictures
right.
of all the wonderful things I get to experience. Like they're just part of life. But I think that once that idea of, oh, like I'm not permanently or consistently here seeps into your mind, you begin to take out your phone and take pictures
Mm.
of all these like small moments or meaningful objects, meaningful spaces. And that's how a lot of the pictures began to make it into the work. I was going back home and not even thinking of, hey, like I'm going to make this piece and it's going to be about this and we're choosing this specific area and we're going to go and shoot. No, it was just I had my phone and I was like revisiting these spaces that were important to me and just like documenting them so that I could like just take them with me, have them on my phone, look at them whenever I wanted to. And then eventually, just with a lot of the things that I was interested in, I was like, okay, let me look at the pictures that I have, because I definitely have pictures about a lot of these, like they're consciously or subconsciously. There is a reason why I'm taking these pictures and they mean something. And a lot of them are of my hometown in Cabo Rojo and certain areas that it's this, I think, like this feeling of protection that gets heightened when you live in a place that, land is being constantly sold to Americans for,
Mhm.
I don't know, whatever tax cuts they're looking for, that so many spaces change because of like the wrath of like hurricanes. I think that you are often looking at things in this nostalgic way, in this way of, I have no idea if like when I come back next summer or winter, these things will be here, or even if they're like they are in the talks of like potentially no longer being there. And like Cabo Rojo for me feels like that place because I think it's a space that I'd say 5, 6 years ago was mostly for locals and was mostly a space where people who wanted to vacation in Puerto Rico and were
Mm-hmm.
living there would just go out there and spend a weekend. But I think today, literally, pieces of land that hold like not only just like emotional value but like archaeological meaning and significance like are being developed or looking to be developed by like foreigners to create these like gated complex living spaces for them. I think that your fears are met. Like at
Mm-hmm.
the time when I was taking those pictures that were coming in, like being a part of the work, I was like, I love this space and I want this space to stay the way that it is, be intact and serve its people. I look at a lot of the spaces that I was documenting. They're now land that is being sold, that has completely other plans that have nothing to
Mm-hmm.
do with the people who live there. And it's the way that I get to the pictures is very I it just comes from a place of a true feeling of protecting that space and to want its like sort of intactfulness, if that even is
Mm-hmm.
a word to just be cherished. And it's interesting to look at them now and to like go back to them and just have that feeling be heightened, those fears be confirmed,
Mm-hmm.
and the pictures to just take a whole different meaning. And of course, I have those pictures on my phone, but like they are made of dust. They are like made of materials that will slowly erode in time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. In the time that we have left, I'd love to invite you to talk about what you're working on currently. You said that you have just started a year-long residency. What are you looking to research there or accomplish? What's on the horizon for your practice as you see it?
Yeah. Oh my God. A lot of things.
I bet, yeah.
It's a hard question. I'm really excited to have this residency at the Sharp Polenta studio program. I think even though I always try to keep myself like making and that making responds to whatever access I have to materials or things, it's really lovely to have this opportunity to just have a space that is mine and that I can completely explode in for a full year. And just, I think be able to have these pieces that are ephemeral be somewhere for a full year and to have me revisit them is really special. So I'm really looking forward to that. I'm working I've been recently working on UV printing and seeing how that form of printing, more mechanical, can also make it into my work, potentially make it onto some sand tiles. I have been like very interested in now that we just finished talking about these spaces in my hometown in Cabo Rojo that are just currently under threat. And I think I am interested in continuing to dive into that territory and that space very much specifically and looking at certain spaces that have been abandoned or that are future proposals of like construction in the area and seeing how maybe my work can respond to those spaces. I'm feeling an incredible urge of being politically involved
Mm,
in such spaces and prioritizing being there, which is hard when I've already committed to a full year being somewhere else. And so I'm trying to negotiate and see how my work can actively respond to those events, but how I can also participate from a distance and potentially physically in whatever form of like community organizing. I think I'm just really grateful to just have a space for a full year and see where that can ultimately lead my work to be
mm-hmm.
also in a space such as New York in conversation with like other printmakers, other sculptors, other artists working with soil, which I think is essential when you are starting a practice or feel like you're still starting a practice with a material that can feel quite unconventional in the context of a market of like contemporary art or whatever that
Mm-hmm.
means.
Yeah, for
So,
sure.
uh, yeah.
Well, where can people find you and follow you and keep up with your work and see what happens in this next exciting year?
So my website, marianaramosortiz.com, or my Instagram, which is La Habichuela, but which translates to the bean in English. That will also be on my website, so you don't have to type it out on Instagram. But mostly those two places is where I like to share whatever I'm up to.
Beautiful. I will put links to both of those in the show notes. And thank you so much for spending some time with me. If you like today's episode, we have a Patreon where you can help support our podcast and get bonus content, like Shop Talk Shorts with past guests. But the very best thing you can do to support this podcast is listen, rate, follow, and share with your fellow print friends around the world. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda, with music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you in 2 weeks.